privilegio para todos nosotros el tenerlo aquí en México, el que haya venido, pues que haya sacrificado tantas otras cosas que hacer por estar aquí con todos ustedes. Entonces nosotros, la doctora Girón y yo, estamos muy agradecidas por esta visita y queremos que esto sea pues el inicio de una importante relación, que todos los que trabajen o vayan a trabajar o estén trabajando África puedan llevar adelante esta relación por muchos años más con el profesor Schneider o con cualquiera incluso de sus alumnos. Entonces vamos a dar pues inicio a esta segunda conferencia. Here, welcome Professor Schneider. We are very happy to have you here. We are very proud that you are such a communication, and of course we want that this is the beginning of a very good relationship with you and our students, especially those on Africa. We think that it is very important for you and for your students to improve this relationship for everybody as well. Bueno, muchas gracias. Entonces tenemos, el profesor nos va a dedicar los próximos 40 minutos, pero no sin antes agradecer también a la Asociación de Economistas Evolucionistas, a la AFI, por toda la ayuda que hemos recibido nosotros en la UNAM para poder tener aquí al profesor Schneider. Thank you to AFI for having us here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming, everybody. A lot about why Sub-Saharan Africa is in worse shape, because it has a lot of lessons, especially for what not to do. Unfortunately, the lessons in Africa are mostly negative because of the kinds of have been ineffective, because Africa has been the place in which neoliberalism has been most strongly implemented since the 1980s. So they had the most experience with austerity, the most experience with opening of markets, and so on. So they had the strongest experience with neoliberalism, and interestingly, the worst economic performance. So, so I'm going to go through a little data at the beginning to show you Africa's economic situation, and then I'm going to talk about why it is failing. So it was very common in the news a few years ago to see this Africa rising narrative, that Africa had finally turned the corner, that it was finally going to develop like the rest of the world. And so there were conferences that the IMF organized, Africa Rising. The Economist had an issue with the cover saying Africa Rising. Everybody was talking about this. And you see things like underlying forces will shape it for the next 30, 50 years. The relative peace and political stability off of a 7-year performance, as if 7 years of good economic performance were going to transform a continent. So if you can see the data here, if you look, this is per capita GDP. By continent, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, relative to everywhere else, it is every other part of as Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the effects of colonialism and slavery on Sub-Saharan Africa have been well documented, they're well known. But what's interesting is how much worse Sub-Saharan Africa has performed since 1950, since independence. And that is where we are learning the economic. So if you look at per capita GDP growth, Africa performs worse than every other region until one time. So there's the 7-year period. So finally, Sub-Saharan Africa, you know, if you go back using the Angus Madison data, you can see that Africa, so the colonial era is where this really starts to change, as is probably no surprise, right? Because slavery completely disrupted the economies of Africa. But it should have changed after independence. Growth performances, and it is particularly poor from 1973 to 3, and then finally a little bit of growth at the end. This is per capita real GDP in real dollars. Sub-Saharan Africa is here. What we see actually, this is broken down by more regions, by poor regions. South Asia was slightly poorer in 2010. That has now changed because South Asia is growing and Sub-Saharan Africa is not, at least relatively speaking. So if we look by 5-year period, actually break this down a little more specifically, we see that Sub-Saharan Africa, this is their good, many other places, it's just a little, and then if you look later, you see that Sub-Saharan Africa falls back below the other regions again. So it's, in fact, it's not even a 7-year period. It's a 4-year period. Now, here's the latest data. So last 7 years, economic boom in theory right after the financial crisis. What do we see? Asia is growing. South Asia, the poorest region historically, because manufacturing is spilling over now from China and other places into South Asia. East Asia is still growing quickly. And Latin America are both at the bottom. And South Africa earlier, and I just wanted to point out for those who were there earlier that it's much worse than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Mexico is a little better than Latin America in general, but these are both pretty bad. During an economic boom, there's not a strong rate of economic growth. Most striking, I think, is the deindustrialization of Sub-Saharan Africa. So manufacturing in 1971 was 17.7%, now 11.6%. So Sub-Saharan Africa experienced the largest amount of deindustrialization of any region. Now, all regions have deindustrialized slightly. That's mostly the change as we move towards services. Finance has become a bigger sector. It's not, but nothing as dramatic as Sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because the import substituting industrialization that they originally engaged in had to stop because of the IMF policies, which basically meant opening up markets, which eroded what little manufacturing that there was. So now 25% of the world's poorest are in Africa, and there's worsening inequality, but all over the continent. Now look, this is foreign aid. You see there's an explosion in foreign aid to Africa. Some of this is the World Bank's new aid to heavily indebted poor countries, but some of it is NGOs in developed countries as well. So there's an explosion of foreign aid. But you know what else there's an explosion of? Corruption. This is illicit financial flows. Notice the parallels, right? Here's foreign aid. Here's illicit financial flows. So, at the same time, more money has been going to Africa, more money has been stolen from Africa in almost exactly a matching quantity. So, why is all the aid leaving the country? Well, and just a little more data on here. Right now, it's a little hard to read this, but right now, South Africa, or Africa gets more aid than other regions because it's poorer, but more money leaves. So much so that illicit financial outflows are now almost completely counteracting the aid that they receive. So it's almost, so 83.7% of the money that is given to Africa also then flows out of Africa. So almost all of the money that it flows in flows out. Which means the idea that Africa is the recipient of aid is an oversimplified notion because the amount of money staying in Africa is, of course, quite small because of the illicit financial flows. And right now, the latest data we have, Sub-Saharan Africa is losing $55 billion per year in illicit financial flows. Which, if you think about how much money that is leaving the poorest region on an annual basis, I mean, it's just incredible. So, some of this is political instability. Right now in Sub-Saharan Africa, 88% of the region's population lives in what is seen as authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states. again, an astounding number. So the democratic project in Africa has not worked well. You have most states out of democracy, even they claim it is, but of course the same party has won every single election for 50 years. What does that even mean? Is it democracy in any meaningful sense? And if you look at fragile states, the 5 most fragile states in the world are all in Africa, and many of the others are near the definition of fragile. It really is a modern crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment because of this fragility and the ongoing. And they have, unlike most countries in Africa, a government that is committed to the population. They found diamonds after the British left. Sub institutions themselves for their own. So if you look at the data, Botswana is the only African country to have sustained economic growth for the last 50 years. Only one. There are others that have periods of economic growth, but the only sustained one. Sorry. But I did want to mention that they have been unable to industrialize. If you know anything about the geography of Africa, you know that all of the infrastructure was set up to extract resources, right, to take resources from the interior of Africa to bring it to the coasts in Africa. So Botswana is an isolated country. It has is poor or dysfunctional, which means they don't have a strong, right? We all know the importance of geography, how being next to a country is very important in your economic opportunity. They were then impacted very negatively by South Africa's de-industrialization. They have the government that's probably most able to engage in industrial transformation, but they can't do it because of their economic situation. I think this is no major industries going through southern Africa, so Botswana has no way to tap into the global networks that other places are able to tap into. A 4-year period of growth as important, but this is misplaced and not consistent with a long-term. What would you need to develop? And if you look, by the way, do you know what drove the boom? You can probably guess. What are Sub-Saharan Africa's biggest exports? What would you guess? Yeah, metals, mining, oil in some countries, cocoa, coffee. So you know what happened from 2000 to 2007? A commodity boom, a commodity price boom. All Sub-Saharan Africa's commodity prices, a commodity price boom, that's what drove economic growth. It was just you're at the mercy of commodity prices, which means when there's an upswing in commodity, crash when there's a decline. And that is not a good development basis, right? Now, what's also been happening, and I can't trust the government, so let's have an NGO do the work. So let's not give money to the government for health. Let's have a health NGO do the health care, and so on. So over and over again now in Africa, we have NGOs taking on consider government roles. So the next question I want to pose is, are NGOs a good way to go in an economy? And I think we also need to understand that there is some veiled libertarianism in this. So you may be familiar with Muhammad Yunus, but I think, at least in the sub-Saharan African context, the ideas have been often used in a destructive way, and that should pull out of most things, except for law enforcement and justice, national defense is private sector, a social consciousness that there is no role for government. Now, you'll have to tell me if the private sector is different here, but in the United States, we cannot trust the private sector to do these sort of things. The idea that the United States would be benevolent in some way, I mean, maybe a few companies, but by and large, that's just not. But because of the context in Africa, because of the corruption, the dominant sector in the economy. I mean, it's an odd social entrepreneurs, and I do work. State is removed from its ability to spend new agencies and things like that. Something has to fill the void, and so in Africa, what has filled the void is NGOs. So this is partly a legacy of neoliberalism. So, for example, most donors in 2008, we don't have very good data on this because for some reason they don't want us to know how prevalent it is, although we can see it. But 30% of aid is going to NGOs instead of the state in 2008, and all the information that we have has since then has demonstrated that has increased substantially in most to NGOs. So, what's the problem with this approach? So the first thing is, for a development strategy to work, you need to scale up, right? You need to create industry, countrywide industries. So here's the question then. Could a small business started by a microfinance loan become a national? So I think, or helped one get started, knows that scaling up to be an industry is not something a small business is capable of. It might take decades for that to happen. But it doesn't prevent people from let me say, delusions. I worked with an NGO in Cape Town, South Africa, that had run some free healthcare clinics. And they said, you know what, they should let us run the healthcare system in South Africa. Now, I know these folks, they're nice folks, but the idea that a small, underfunded NGO is going to run a healthcare system, again, not realistic. And why would this be better? Now, think about that very carefully, because NGOs, right, who give them money, is that who you want them to answer to? Maybe, but it's a complicated question. So, and then, donors are notoriously capricious. They fund you one year, and then next year they're out of money somehow, so they don't give you money the next. NGOs tend to be less efficient than state-provided. We have a crazy healthcare system in the U.S., perhaps you know a little about it. Our publicly provided Medicare and Medicaid is half the cost of private insurance. So, you know, do you want the private sector involved in that? The end is terribly inefficient compared to government. So Medicare and Medicaid in the U.S. are much more efficient. Just as another example, NGO nutrition services in Bangladesh, 22% more expensive than the state services that provide the same thing. Hunger in the U.S. We used to have government programs that pretty much eradicated hunger. Then we stopped doing that, and now we have private charities do it. The private charities mean well, but now we have a hunger problem. The U.S. is terribly unequal, as you probably know, and so we have 50 million Americans every day going to bed hungry. In a country as rich as ours, it's unbelievable. But this is what relying on NGOs has done. They are not able to provide comprehensive support. And then you get things like water in South Africa. So the government is told to privatize things. And so they decide to privatize water supply, of all things. And so they sell it to NGOs that are run by corporations. And so they raise prices 59% to 600%. Now, if you're a poor South African living in one of the townships with an income of maybe $1 a day, outbreaks of cholera that hadn't happened for 70 years in South Africa. And so this is what relying on NGOs for water in South Africa did. So, you know, the idea that you would provide basic services for your people by NGOs has not played out very well. You also have a weakening, here's something that people don't ever think about. The people out of Africa's governments into the NGO sector. So in Ethiopia, so by the way, I should say, a lot of this work was done with my colleague Berhanu Nega from Ethiopia. And so when we were there, we found that NGOs pay 5 to 11 times better than working government. So of course, if you're a smart Ethiopian, similar things in South Africa where you can make more money. Action program, the Black Economic Empowerment, staying in government. So the NGO sector in Africa has created development policy without good government. And then it props up corrupt governments. In Ethiopia, when they were incredibly oppressive, and they changed, they were given a huge, the year after they got that grant, the government won 99.5% of the vote. That's how democratic Ethiopia was. You ever know any government to win 99.5% of the vote? So, how can a corrupt government, a government that is this deeply corrupt, be given a grant for the abuses that they are actually perpetrating? All right, now I want to talk about microfinance in a little more detail. Microfinance is it working here? Because it's not in Africa.
No, it's not.
Not here either. So, I mean, I guess we can understand the appeal of microfinance, right? Because, all right, so your government isn't functional. Maybe we can, with a tiny little bit of money and organization, people can develop themselves. They don't need government to do it. So, it's a theoretically reasonable proposition. And everybody has jumped on board, but of course, if you look at who has jumped on board the most, you start to get an idea of who's really behind this, right? So it's USAID and the World Bank. Anything they touch, has a particular ideological agenda. Corporate foundations, they want. What does Citibank want out of it? Is it just benevolent? Get back. Foundations established by wealthy entrepreneurs who just think if everybody just had a little more of the market system, they would be great. So again, all the business schools in the U.S. love this. Is that true here? Yeah, I love it. All we need is to start more entrepreneurs, and everything will solve itself. And Eunice and the Grameen Bank were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in 2006. So this has become hugely important. The top 50 increased in size. There's now a massive amount of money going into microfinance. Stated claims. So here's a claim that was made. The Grameen Bank and the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee demonstrated that it was possible to mitigate poverty on a massive scale, eradicated poverty in Bangladesh. What is the data? Not true, right? Info alleviates poverty. None. Why? Well, so the first thing is, I've done work with social entrepreneurs. I've done work with small businesses. It's often one person, right, doing something on a small scale. So they create micro enterprises. Microfinance creates small enterprises, and that doesn't lead to much else. It does help the individual families often. So it helps small families and communities a little bit in production operations. So in South Africa, a lot of the microfinance is making crafts to sell to tourists. There are now substantial support from big institutional players and an industrialization strategy and a national plan with a developmental state, not some micro enterprises. It diverts resources and they take it away from other efforts. So there's a direct statistical correlation between the rise of funding for microfinance and a decline in funding for other development efforts, which is a problem given that it's not working very well. And then we have the high salaries, as we mentioned, the brain drain. So staff in Guinea, for example, went on strike when they heard lower than USAID. The whole development worker and microfinance is drawing workers out of other opportunities. And this is the expenses. So operating expenses. This is a very large number. Why does it cost 14%? Why do you have to add 14% to the interest rate because of your operating expenses? Where would you guess that goes? It goes to the people running the organization, basically, right? So you have to fund your organization somehow. It's very expensive, evidently, to run these, right? So the bureaucracy of the microfinance institution. There are some legitimate financial expenses. You expect someone to fail, and this is an amazingly low number. It is still true that microloans the failure rate is actually below the rate for standard loans. Look at they still make a profit as well. But you add all that up, how many? 27%. So that's especially true of, for example, in Ethiopia, as I was mentioning, we did a lot of work there. Almost all, 90% of the people who got loans just happened to be connected with the government. I'm sure it was just luck, but and then the state used its oppressive apparatus for loan collection, right? So if you were not one of the government's friends and you didn't pay, they have to. So become the government. They even did this with fertilizer and other things. So they manipulate. The Ethiopian government was famous for manipulating the process so that they used NGO money and microfinance money to enhance their power and control over the economy. Which is ironic because what was the whole point of NGOs, right? To move it away from the state. So in a corrupt government, that is not what's happening. All right, we're an AIDS foundation. We give money for AIDS, so that's what we have money for, to help their communities and serve people for the community and the community. So it's a thing. And it's useful because it encourages community building. It builds partnerships. So University of Cape Town is doing things in this area where they're not doing other things. So this has created more connections with the university than other things. But what I discovered in South Africa, for example, is that there's a whole sector of the market that's not being addressed. Poor people buy different things in different quantities than rich people do, right? But nobody's producing those things. So a whole grown up now that's actually doing quite well, which is basically making goods for poor people, which the market had ignored because you can't make enough money at the market. But actually, I think, right, you have to have something else to develop it at a larger scale. How can you convert this into a national economic development plan? It's not going to happen on its own because a small business able to make those steps. So I think we cannot allow social entrepreneurship to replace or resist efforts for a democratic developmental state. When I read the quote from Eunice, as I showed you, this is the goal. So you have to be very careful in what these people are promoting. And we also have to be careful when it's captured for ulterior motives. So to me then, the best bets for sub-Saharan African development are to find a method for capturing capital and fostering local investment, which is what every European country is doing, which is what Japan did, which is what South Korea did. And then you have to have a developmental state. There's just no avoiding that. And so instead of removing the state, you need to build state capacity, right? So I still find it, the honest thing isn't that the thing they need to do most is help people form and then actually achieve the development process. And that is clearly one. And then I do think that we can rethink businesses in the poorest communities. So, I was mentioning those sort of the bottom billion businesses that are products in South Africa. They're now producing goods that are exported to other poor income, not the kind of income that Western countries or Western investors care about, but it's generating real income for real people in poor communities. So I think we can rethink business import substituting industrialization. And that was also true for Latin America by and large. So I think if we think about it, that worked better. Our hands were tied by the World Bank, and we had to move away from that, and then things got worse. So I think we have a decent model. We just have to resist the powers that are forcing us into something else. Thank you.
Adelante.
Yeah.
¿Te presentas tu nombre?
Yeah. Soy Javier Sacristán, and I would like to know your point of view of the economic growth of Somaliland, and if there is really in Somaliland and digamos a little economic growth, but I would like if you can go deeper, if you know something about Somaliland.
So the first thing is most data in Sub-Saharan Africa is made up. So, just as an example, the Ethiopian government that they had 10% for the last 10 years. And yet they're still desperately poor and people are still starving. So where's the growth? So unless I've been on the ground talking to people and seeing it, I don't trust any of the data. And I certainly don't trust it coming out things are better. I just don't know the magnitude. It's hard for me to tell without actually having been there recently. I wish I had more data on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is true in general. again, I don't know how good your data are, but data in Sub-Saharan Africa it's comical. You would never base your policy on data. You have to go out in communities and see what's happening, because you cannot trust any of the data that comes out. Because those governments that we were talking about, they all want to make themselves look good. They all make up data that makes them look good. And then even if it's not made up, they can't capture, most of the economy in most Sub-Saharan Africa is informal, right? So it's only measuring the formal sector. So how do you actually measure the actual economic activity? It just doesn't mean very much. Same here?
Nuestro presidente Fox, ¿se acuerdan, no? Que inventaba los datos. Otra pregunta. Preguntas. Aprovecha porque su profesor.
Well, specifically when we talk about privatization in Latin America, it is very much felt like the base was taken off our foot, per se. But in Africa, it seems that that base wasn't made just yet, and that they're trying to do a prior privatization before the public even makes it. We're going to make it privatized beforehand. And I think, at least how I interpret it, is that if you're saying that they're making up data, they're entering into kind of a financialization logic of how good we are resources, but it's not the country. It's because who's financing all this?
Right. Yeah. So the one thing about Africation in Sub-Saharan Africa went further from a lower base, I think. So, but you're right about the money. So, there are two different types of regimes in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think we should differentiate. There are the clientelistic ones, which have a very narrow base. They only care about their own clan, which is probably a small part of the country, and the military. So they keep them happy. They send the money to their Swiss bank account. They have international partners that help them do that. Anybody know Equatorial Guinea? So Equatorial Guinea is one of the most corrupt dictatorships in the world, and they were desperately poor until oil. When they found oil, the U.S. not only helped them drill it, but we protect their dictator. You know, we actually have mercenaries that we train and support. Why? Because they send us their oil, of course, right? Equatorial Guinea is now, according to data, but it's all in the hands of the ruling family, all of it. None of it in the hands of the population. And I use that example to say that in a lot of the countries that are clientelistic, in which there is a relationship between the government, it's always between the government and somebody. It's between the Nigerian government or Equatorial Guinea and the U.S. government, or, you know, it's always a relationship between, and sometimes it's NGOs too, which also have their own agenda. You know, I know a lot of aid workers who have their own interests at heart first. You know, so but there are also, for example, governments that aren't very democratic where they do have a national interest. So I would say Museveni in Uganda is an example of that, where he's won every election for a very long time, but he actually cares about his country and is trying to develop. So I don't like that he's undemocratic. Some of that is driven by the fact that there's an ongoing conflict and you know, the regional conflicts as well. But at the end of the day, he reinvests in his country, whereas the Ethiopian dictators and the Equatorial Guinea dictators do not. And that means there's a huge variance there in terms of economic development.
We talk about NGOs. Okay, we talk about NGOs and how does their work do not constitute a development strategy in Africa, because the external funding from donors is temporary and eventually runs out. But what about the work of the government of China and in the mark of projects like over 1 billion, the constant invest in Africa, because we know that if Africa governments, it's like, yay, there is money in Africa, but we don't know the conditions of the investments of China and how can it be the consequences of these investments.
That's a great question. I mean, so China is making a huge push in Africa. They are after resources. So the one thing Africa has lots of is mineral resources, and including rare earth metals, which are crucial for computers. So China is doing all sorts of things, and they're really smart about how they do it. What they do is they sort of identify the needs of particular places and how corrupt they are, if they can be bought off. And if they can be bought off, buy them off. And if they can't, they actually will do some things like they'll build some roads, they'll open some banks, and they will do some things in addition to resources back to China. So, I mean, China is very sophisticated with climate change and things like that, that they're predicting higher commodities prices, higher prices of food, and with their own population, they think that they need, so China is buying land all over Africa. And the governments of Africa are poor and or corrupt, and therefore often only too happy to sell China land. So most of the governments in Africa are doing everything they can to let China come in and do almost whatever they want. And incidentally, the West has not countered. So the West is not offering Africa more aid, the West is not offering more development assistance. So the West is strong where it already has operations, but it's not doing what China's doing, which is developing new operations in new places.
So we can talk now about a new era of neo-colonialism.
Yeah, and a lot of people are talking about it.
China is a later version.
Right. And it comes into Africa, they set up their own enclave that's very independent, so it's not integrated, so that there's no evidence that this is going to be a long-term relationship. China is getting something out of it, and that's what they're there for. I suppose that's, of course, what the U.S. has always done too, so perhaps that's no different. We get our oil from Equatorial Guinea, they get their nickel from Zambia.
Yeah, I would like to know your thoughts about international aid, because China is doing this way. Also are, or have done it in the last century. And, well, at least in the 20th century, we saw no results. But how is it going on?
Yeah, that's a great topic. So international aid has mostly, so there's so many different kinds of international aid, so we really have to differentiate. So for example, the U.S. gives aid to some African countries, but we make them buy U.S. things with it. So we don't really give them money. We give them planes that we bought for them and things like that. So much of U.S. aid is not really aid. Then there's international financial institutions, World Bank and IMF. Their aid, of course, comes with strings. The kinds of aid that I like are, for example, the Nordic countries give aid often with no strings attached. They give it to communities, but they let the community establish the priorities. So, for example, one of the poor townships in South Africa I work in was able to draw up a proposal for a health clinic. The Swedish government just funded it. They said, that's a good project, we should fund that. And so there were no strings, there was no effort to say, buy our stuff, anything like that. It was just aid for what the community identified as its need. And I think more aid like that would make a much more positive, I mean, if you give aid to a corrupt dictatorship, are you propping up that dictatorship? Are you enabling ongoing exploitation? It's a very difficult thing to evaluate, because if you cut the aid, you will hurt people in the country. But the fact is, you are probably helping to prop up a government, because with the absence of that aid, the country might collapse, and then you might see change. But you would only see that change after a major disruption. And so we never know what to do with that. I think Zimbabwe was instructive, because after their crisis and the corruption of the government there, aid to Zimbabwe, so getting international aid, we thought the government would collapse. They have not. The same corrupt group of people is still in power there. So I think the history of West and other aid donors telling Africa what to do has been very destructive. So at minimum, aid should be to help people do what they want to do, and the needs need to be defined by the local community. And aid that doesn't have that as its motive, I am deeply suspicious of. That's a great question. So if you couldn't hear, Polanyi in Africa, and Polanyi is this famous concept of the double movement, in which when the market system is creating negative externalities, but poverty, other problems, people will organize in response to that. And in that organization, you will get some efforts to reform the market, and you will get change out of that sort of conflict between the market system's results and people's needs. Studies on particular places where that's happening, but there's no book about the whole continent, partly because of its diversity, but I can give you a couple specific examples. So one is in Ethiopia. So I don't know how much people follow the news, but last year, Ethiopia, the new president said that they were going to stop, their one-party state. They were going to open up to full-fledged democracy, and they were going to stop basically stealing. And that was when my colleague, Berhanu Nego, went back to the country. So, but before the reason that he stopped is because the country had been rendered almost ungovernable by protests. So there were almost daily protests in every town around the country. And then armed resistance started to crop up too, because people were so frustrated. So in fact, it was exactly that. The conditions in Ethiopia were so many people organized that it forced that government to actually change in a more positive direction. And so my friend may actually be the next president. They're having local elections later this year and national elections the next year. So I think incredibly positive change, all brought about by exactly the process you're talking about. And then in South Africa, where I've been working most recently and most intensively, the townships and the young generations are organizing together. And so they view the ANC as traders, linking their economy from the capitalist economy. So they want to develop internal exchange. They want to produce their own food for their own people and their own industries, and not buy from the West and not buy from anybody else. And at the same time, they've been boycotting universities because the fees are too expensive. So they closed the University of Cape Town in 2016, for example, with their boycotts. And they made University of Cape Town address the fact that they were supporting the status quo, and they made them start giving scholarships to people who couldn't afford it. So you will always see those resistance. The question is how powerful the government is and whether these resistance movements have some traction. In Ethiopia, though, it changed the regime completely. In South Africa, I think it will. I think it's going to take more time.
I'm wondering about the services sector, because the manufacturing apparently is not really working.
Right.
Then, especially in Botswana, I heard that they were investing a lot in tourism, especially for the safaris.
Right.
Do you find real opportunity for development in that industry?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So can you develop via tourism? Costa Rica has done quite well with ecotourism. So I think a small country can maybe do that to a certain degree.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, but I think there are limits, right? Because, so one of the things about tourism is, in general, tourists like to buy things that they're familiar with. So, for example, when they go there, they don't want a domestic beer, they want a imported beer, right? So you often don't gain that much foreign exchange for tourism, so you have to do it very carefully. So, for example, what Costa Rica does is this outrageously high tax on imported alcohol. So A local beer would be $1 US, and an imported one would be 5. So what they did, they set up tourism, but they also had some thoughts about the tourist industry and the kinds of things that are destructive, but also the kinds of things that can help you capture the foreign exchange that you need. So I think a tourist industry done carefully can help. But Costa Rica, despite its huge emphasis on that, is getting more money out of more development out of development of the electronic sector. So they spent a huge amount of effort to ecotourism, but that still is small compared to electronics. So I wonder how much you could do that. Botswana is a small country, not that many people, so the money that they're getting from safaris is important, and I think it's useful, but I think it's a limited opportunity. Now, are there other services? I still think the former English colonies could be doing what India is doing with call centers. So, you know, there's no reason that any English-speaking country can't do that. And in Botswana and South Africa, both, they speak very good English. So I think there are other services that are more lucrative, that are probably better in terms of actual generation of income and foreign exchange. I mean, I also think we need to think creatively. You know, the development models that you would industrialize, maybe that's not the future. So, you know, it's funny that in the poor South African townships, you have solar panels. So they've given up on an electric grid because the government's never going to provide one for them. But they have solar panels, so they have electricity. And it's because these small businesses have started them and financed them. And so they skip the grid entirely. And I wonder how many more things like that there are where you can think about leapfrogging in development and starting things. But you have, you know, I don't think we know what form that would be either.
Well, ¿hay más preguntas?
Yeah, just about these businesses that you mentioned just at the end of your talk. What kind of businesses are these ones? Like, who is funding these? You talk about that they are making small villages, right?
Making?
Yeah, like in the small villages, for example, you talk about South Africa, they are making businesses, like locally.
Right.
So how are they doing? What are they doing? Who is funding?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, some of them are actually targeting the tourist industry. So one of the things about the tourist industry, Cape Town is of course a beautiful place, but the tourists come in, they spend all their money in the urban area, and the money never gets out to the poor townships. So some of it is they created businesses to bring people out to the townships, historical tours to talk about apartheid, for example, and restaurants that give a true South African experience as opposed to the touristy versions of it. So there's some tourism. There's some small manufacturing where they make things that, and this is the most exciting, I think, they make things that other South Africans want that are poor. So they make different, they're a little lower quality, they're a little smaller size, but they're things that people want. So I think the most exciting thing is the small manufacturing that's happening. And many more things. I mean, there's still a lot of effort to develop some larger scale industries, but that's not been very successful yet because they don't have the government support.
Well, Geoffrey, thank you very much. I am to give you a bag. This is our logo of the Purea. It's a lotus, because the lotus is in the ocean and also in Africa. And then you're going to have, well, if you go to the gym, you can have your bag. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And we are very happy that you all are here at home, and we hope this is not going to be the last time. I think we have to learn more about Africa, and we will continue to share with us. And thank you for having me also.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.